There is a particular kind of exhaustion that no one talks about openly. It is not the exhaustion from working too hard or sleeping too little. It is the exhaustion that comes from being around someone who consistently leaves you feeling diminished, confused, or quietly wrong about yourself. And what makes it so difficult to name is that it rarely announces itself. It accumulates. You do not wake up one morning and decide that a person is harmful to you. It happens gradually, through 1,000 small moments that you rationalize individually, but that form a pattern you cannot see until you step far enough back. The patterns you operate within often run quietly beneath conscious awareness, and that is precisely why cutting contact, truly severing the psychological connection with someone, is one of the most misunderstood decisions a person can make. People around you will call it dramatic. They will call it avoidance. They will suggest you work it out, that you are being too sensitive, that everyone has flaws. And they are not wrong that everyone has flaws. But they are missing something essential: the difference between someone whose flaws create friction and someone whose presence systematically disrupts your internal coherence. Those are not the same thing, and psychology does not treat them the same way. The first sign is one most people misread entirely. When you are around this person, you find yourself choosing your words with unusual care, not out of respect, out of anticipation. You have learned through emotional conditioning that you are likely never conscious of, that certain reactions follow certain expressions. So, you pre-edit yourself. You leave out the part of your thought that might cause a reaction. You soften the sentence before it leaves your mouth. And over time, this becomes automatic. You stop noticing that you are doing it. Clinical psychology recognizes this pattern as a learned suppression response, the kind that emerges when an environment repeatedly signals that authentic expression is unsafe. The second sign is related but distinct. After spending time with this person, you feel the need to mentally reconstruct what happened, not to enjoy the conversation again, but to understand it, to locate the moment where something shifted, to figure out why you walked away feeling vaguely at fault for something you cannot name. Psychologists consistently observe this in people navigating relationships with chronically invalidating individuals. The reconstruction is not neurotic. It is your mind attempting to restore internal coherence that the interaction disrupted. Third, and this one is quiet, your sense of your own perception begins to soften. You start wondering whether your interpretation of events is reliable. You remember something one way, they remember it differently, and their version is delivered with such confidence that yours begins to feel unstable. This is not ordinary disagreement. Ordinary disagreement does not erode your confidence in your own memory. What erodes your confidence in your own memory is sustained contact with someone who treats your perception as the variable and theirs as the fixed point. Therapeutic practice often reveals that this form of relational pressure is one of the more insidious because it targets not your behavior, but your epistemic trust in yourself. The fourth sign is that your nervous system responds before your conscious mind does. You see their name appear on your phone, and before you have decided how to feel about it, your body has already answered. A tightening, a subtle shift in breath. This is not metaphor, this is neurological. The body encodes relational experience through repeated association, and when it has accumulated enough data about what contact with a particular person costs you, it begins signaling ahead of conscious thought. Many people dismiss this physiological response because they cannot justify it intellectually. They do not have a clean argument for why the person is harmful. They only have a body that has stopped trusting. Fifth, you begin to notice that your behavior around this person does not resemble your behavior elsewhere. You are smaller, more careful, more agreeable, less inclined to assert a position, and afterward you feel a quiet contempt, not always for them, but for the version of yourself that appeared in their presence. What is happening here is something Jung would have recognized clearly. You are collapsing into a persona constructed not from your own self-expression, but from the implicit requirements of surviving the interaction. The mask you wear around them is not chosen, it is adaptive. It is what you became in order to manage the social pressure of their presence. And the contempt you feel after is the shadow, the suppressed authentic parts of yourself, pressing back. Sixth, when you try to raise a concern with this person, the conversation does not move toward resolution. It moves toward your concern being reframed as the problem. Your timing is wrong. Your tone is wrong. Your sensitivity is the issue. The concern itself is never engaged. This is not a communication style difference. It is a structural dynamic, one where accountability is perpetually redirected. Psychologists consistently observe that individuals who cannot tolerate being seen as the source of another person's distress will systematically convert any attempt at honest communication into a conversation about the other person's deficiencies. The result is that you stop raising concerns not because things improve, but because you have been conditioned to associate honest expression with being made worse. The seventh sign is that your relationship with your own needs becomes distorted. You begin to feel that wanting things, time, consistency, honesty, basic acknowledgement, is somehow excessive. This distortion does not arrive from nowhere. It is installed through repeated encounters where your needs were treated as burdens, demands, or evidence of your unreasonableness. And eventually, you internalize the verdict. You become someone who preemptively minimizes their own requirements, not because those requirements were actually unreasonable, but because the cost of expressing them became too high. Eighth, other relationships in your life begin to suffer, not because you have less to give, but because the psychological load of managing this one relationship consumes a disproportionate amount of your internal resources. Emotional regulation, cognitive bandwidth, the capacity to be present, these are finite, and when a significant portion of them is being used to anticipate, decode, and recover from one relationship, what remains for everything else diminishes. People close to you notice something, though they may not be able to name it, and you may not be able to name it either, because the depletion happens gradually enough to feel like your new baseline. Ninth, the version of yourself you remember being, clearer, less anxious, more grounded in your own perception, feels further away than it used to. This is one of the more existentially significant signs, and it is almost never framed as a relational consequence. People attribute their diminishment to age, stress, circumstance, but clinical psychology recognizes that chronic exposure to certain relational environments does not simply affect mood, it affects the architecture of how a person relates to themselves. The self that is constantly being undermined, second-guessed, or emotionally pressured becomes a self that begins to lose access to its own coherence. And 10th, perhaps the most telling, is that the prospect of ending the relationship feels more frightening than the relationship itself. Not because the relationship is good, but because it has been going on long enough and with enough intensity that it has become structurally embedded in your sense of self. The thought of removing it produces a kind of vertigo. Who are you without this dynamic? What will you do with the anxiety that currently has a name and a target? This attachment, not to the person exactly, but to the relational pattern, is what keeps most people inside relationships that are hollowing them out. It is not weakness. It is the predictable result of being psychologically organized around an environment for long enough that leaving it feels like losing ground, even when the ground was never solid. What cutting contact actually does, when it is the psychologically sound decision, is not primarily about punishment, protection, or statement. It is about removing a variable that has become too embedded in your internal experience to be metabolized in any other way. Some relationships can be navigated with distance, with recalibrated expectations, with honest conversation. But when the conversation consistently cannot happen, when presence itself is the mechanism of disruption, then contact is not a neutral act, and removing it is not avoidance. It is an act of psychological coherence. The quiet realization, if you stay with this long enough, is that you were never failing to manage the relationship. You were succeeding, brilliantly, exhaustingly, at adapting to something that was never going to adapt back. And that recognition, once it settles, does not feel like anger. It feels more like the particular clarity that arrives when you finally stop explaining something to someone who was never listening. If this video gave you something worth keeping, consider subscribing to this channel. We publish videos like this regularly for people who take their inner life seriously. If it resonated with you, share it with someone who might need it. Like the video so more people can find it, and turn on the notification bell so you are there when the next one arrives.